Okay, friends, we finally have a copy of the book. So, huzzah! Yes, it's very exciting. I'm very, very excited to finally have like an actual imprinted copy. It doesn't mean that my stammering and stumbling over words is going to get any better, but it does mean that it'll be my fault as opposed to getting to blame it on a hyphen. But it's just like, I was an English major and I still really hate hyphens. Hyphens are the worst. So don't do it. Don't hyphenate things. Don't auto-hyphenate things. Just don't do it. They're the worst. The worst. Anyway, so we are reading The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, and we tonight are on chapter 6, and we'll probably do 6 and 7, or maybe 6, 7, and 8. We'll see how it goes. We normally do about 20 pages a night, and that takes about an hour, which is way slower than it would take you to read on your own. But reading out loud is slower than reading on your own. But it helps with retention a little bit better and comprehension maybe a little bit better because you hear the sentence structure. And Nathaniel Hawthorne's sentence structure, none of us would get a passing grade for because it's all run-on sentences and nonsense most of the time. So you have to, hearing it out loud, I think maybe helps a little bit. So chapter 6 is where we finally get to meet the kid. So chapter 6 is called Pearl. We have as yet hardly spoken of the infant, that little creature whose innocent life had sprung by the inscrutable decree of Providence, a lovely and immortal flower out of the rank luxuriance of a guilty passion. How strange it seemed to the sad woman as she watched the growth and the beauty that became every day more brilliant and the intelligence that threw its quivering sunshine over the tiny features of this child. Her Pearl, for so had Hester called her, not as a name expressive of her aspect, which had nothing of the calm, white, unimpassioned luster that would be indicated by the comparison. But she named the infant Pearl as being of great price, purchased with all she had, her mother's only treasure. How strange indeed. Man had marked this woman's sin by a scarlet letter which had such potent and disastrous efficacy that no human sympathy could reach her, save it were simple like herself. God, as a direct consequence of the sin which man thus punished, had given her a lovely child whose place on that same dishonored bosom whose place was on that same dishonored bosom, and to connect her parent forever with the race and descent of mortals, and to be finally a blessed soul in heaven. Yet these thoughts affected Hester Prynne less with hope than apprehension. She knew that her deed had been evil. She could have no faith, therefore, that its result would be good. Day after day, she looked fearfully into the child's expanding nature, ever dreading to detect some dark and wild peculiarity that should correspond with the guiltiness for which she owed her being. Certainly, there was no physical defect. By its perfect shape, its vigor, and its natural dexterity in the use of all its untried limbs, the infant was worthy to have been brought forth in Eden, worthy to have been left there to be the plaything of the angels after the world's first parents were driven out. The child had a native grace which does not invariably coexist with faultless beauty. Its attire, however simple, always impressed the beholder as if it were the very garb that precisely became its best. The little Pearl was not clad in rustic weeds. Her mother, with a morbid purpose that may be better understood hereafter, had bought the richest tissues that could be procured and allowed her imaginative faculty to full play in an arrangement and decoration of dresses which the child wore before the public eye. So magnificent was the small figure thus arrayed. And such was the splendor of Pearl's own proper beauty, shining through the gorgeous robes which might have extinguished her paler loveliness, that there was an absolute circle of radiance around her on the darksome cottage floor. And yet, a russet gown, torn and soiled with the child's rude play, made a picture of her just perfect. Pearl's aspect was imbued with the spell of infinite variety. In this one child, there were many children, comprehending the full scope between the wildflower prettiness of a peasant baby and the pomp in little of an infant princess. Throughout all, however, there was a trait of passion, a certain depth of hue, which she never lost. And if in any of her changes she had grown fainter or paler, she would not have ceased to be herself. It would have been no longer Pearl. This outward mutability indicated and did not more than fairly express the various properties of her inner life. Her nature appeared to possess depth, too, as well as a variety, but, or else Hester's fears deceived her, it lacked reference and adaptation to the world into which she was born. The child could not be made amenable to the rules. In giving her existence, a great law had been broken, and the result was a being whose elements were perhaps beautiful and brilliant, but all in disorder, or with an order peculiar to themselves, amidst which the point of variety and arrangement was difficult or impossible to be discovered. Hester could only account for the child's character, and even then most vaguely and imperfectly, by recalling that she herself had been, during that momentous period while Pearl was imbibing her soul from the spiritual world, and her body frame from its material of earth, the mother's impassioned state had been the medium through which were transmitted to the unborn infant the rays of its mortal life, and however white and clear originally, they had taken deep stains of crimson and gold, of the fiery luster, the black shadow, and the untempered light of the intervening substance. Above all, the warfare of Hester's spirit at that epoch was perpetuated in Pearl. She could recognize her wild, desperate, defiant mood, the flightiness of her temper, and even some of the very cloud shapes of gloom and despondency that had been brooded in her heart. They were now illuminated by the morning radiance of a young child's disposition, but later in the day of earthly existence might be prolific of the storm and whirlwind. The discipline of the family in those days was a far more rigid kind than now. The frown, a harsh rebuke, the frequent application of the rod, enjoined by scriptural authority, were used not merely in a way of punishment for actual offenses, but as a wholesome regimen for the growth and promotion of all childish virtues. Hester Prynne, nevertheless, the lonely mother of this one child, ran little risk of erring on the side of undue severity. Mindful, however, of her own errors and misfortunes, she early sought to impose a tender but strict control over the infant immortality that was committed to her charge. But the task was beyond her skill. After testing both smiles and frowns and proving that neither mode of treatment possessed any calculable influence, Hester was ultimately compelled to stand aside and permit the child to be swayed by her own impulses. Physical compulsion or restraint was effectual, of course, while it lasted. As to any other kind of discipline, whether addressed to her mind or heart, little Pearl might or might not be within its reach, in accordance with the caprice that ruled the moment. Her mother, while Pearl was yet an infant, grew acquainted with a certain peculiar look that warned her. Mercutio. Her mother, while Pearl was yet an infant, grew acquainted with a certain peculiar look that warned her when it would be labor thrown away to insist, persuade, or plead. It was a look so intelligent yet inexplicable, so perverse, sometimes so malicious, but generally accompanied by a wild flow of spirits, that Hester could not help questioning at such moments whether Pearl was a human child. She seemed rather an airy sprite, which after playing its fantastic sports for a little while upon the cottage floor, would flit away with a mocking smile. Whenever that look appeared in her wild, bright, deeply black eyes, it invested her with a strange remoteness and intangibility. It was as if she were hovering in the air and might vanish like a glimmering light that comes we know not whence, and goes we know not whither. Beholding it, Hester was constrained to rush towards the child, to pursue the little elf in flight, which she invariably began, to snatch her to her bosom with a close pressure and earnest kisses, not so much from overflowing love, but as to assure herself that Pearl was flesh and blood and not utterly delusive. But Pearl's laugh, when she was caught, was full of merriment and music, and made her mother more doubtful than before. Heart smitten at this bewildering and baffling spell that so often came between herself and her sole treasure, whom she had bought so dear, and who was all her world, Hester sometimes burst into passionate tears. Then, perhaps, for there was no foreseeing how it might affect her, Pearl would frown and clench her little fist and harden her small features into a stern, unsympathizing look of discontent. Not seldom she would laugh anew and louder than before, like a thing incapable and unintelligent of human sorrow. Or, but this more rarely happened, she would be convulsed with rage of grief and sob out her love for her mother in broken words and seem intent on proving that she had a heart by breaking it. Yet Hester was hardly safe in confiding herself to that ghastly tenderness. It passed as suddenly as it came. Brooding over all these matters, the mother felt like one who has invoked a spirit, but by some irregularity in the process of conjuration had failed to win the master word that would control this new and incomprehensible intelligence. Her only real comfort was when the child lay in the placidity of sleep. Then she was sure of her, and tasted hours of quiet, sad, delicious happiness until, perhaps with that perverse expression glimmering from beneath her opening lids, little Pearl awoke. How soon, with what strange rapidity indeed, did Pearl arrive at an age that was capable of social intercourse, beyond the mother's ever-ready smile and nonsense words. And then, what a happiness would it have been could Hester Prynne have heard her clear, bird-like voice mingling with an uproar of other childish voices, and have distinguished and unraveled her own darling's tones amid all the entangled outcry of a group of sportive children. But this could never be. Pearl was a born outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem, and product of sin. She had no right among christened infants. Nothing was more remarkable than the instinct, as it seemed, with which the child comprehended her loneliness. The destiny that had drawn an invocable circle round her, the whole peculiarity, in short, of her position in respect to other children. Never, since her release from prison, had Hester met the public gaze without her. In all her walks about the town, Pearl too was there. First as the babe in arms, and afterwards as a little girl, small companion to her mother, holding a forefinger with her whole grasp and tripping along at the rate of 3 or 4 footsteps to one of Hester's. She saw the children in the settlement, on the grassy margin of the street, or in their domestic thresholds, disporting themselves in such grim fashion as the puritanic nurture would permit, playing at going to church, perchance, or at scourging Quakers, or taking scalps in a sham fight with the Indians, or scaring one another with freaks of imitative witchcraft. Pearl saw and gazed intently, but never sought to make acquaintance. If spoken to, she would not speak again. If the children gathered about her, as they sometimes did, Pearl would grow positively terrible in her puny wrath, snatching up stones to fling at them with shrill, incoherent exclamations that made her mother tremble, because they had so much the sound of a witch's anathemas in some unknown tongue. The truth was that the little Puritans, being of the most intolerant brood that had ever lived, had got a vague idea of something outlandish, unearthly, or at variance with ordinary fashions in the mother and child, and therefore scorned them in their hearts, and not infrequently reviled them with their tongues. Pearl felt the sentiment, and requited it with the bitterest hatred that can be supposed to rankle in a childish bosom. These outbreaks of a fierce temper had a kind of value and even a comfort for her mother, because there was at least an intelligible earnestness in the mood, instead of a fitful caprice that so often thwarted her in the child's manifestations. It appalled her, nevertheless, to discern here again a shadowy reflection of the evil that had existed in herself. All this enmity and passion had Pearl inherited by inalienable right out of Hester's heart. Mother and daughter stood together in the same circle of seclusion from human society, and in the nature of the child seemed to be perpetuated those unquiet elements that had distracted Hester Prynne before Pearl's birth, but had since begun to be soothed away by the softening influences of maternity. At home, within and around her mother's cottage, Pearl wanted not a wide and various circle of acquaintance. The spell of life went forth from her ever-creative spirit and communicated itself to 1,000 objects, as a torch kindles a name wherever it might be applied. The unlikeliest materials, a stick, a bunch of rags, a flower, were the puppets of Pearl's witchcraft, and without undergoing any outward change, became spiritually adopted to whatever drama occupied this stage of her inner world. Her once baby voice served a multitude of imaginary personages, old and young, to talk with all. The pine trees, aged, black, and solemn, and flinging groans and other melancholy utterances on the breeze, needed little transformation to figure as Puritan elders. The ugliest weeds of the garden were their children, whom Pearl smote down and uprooted most unmercifully. It was wonderful, the vast variety of forms into which she threw her intellect, with no continuity indeed, but darting up and dancing always in a state of preternatural activity, soon sinking down, as if exhausted by so rapid and feverish a tide, and succeeded by other shapes of a similar wild energy. It was like nothing so much as a phantasmagoric play of the northern lights. In the mere exercise of the fancy, however, and the sportiveness of the growing mind, there might be a little more than observable in other children of bright faculties, except as Pearl, in the dearth of human playmates, was thrown more upon the visionary throng which she created. The singularity lay in the hostile feelings with which the child regarded all those offsprings of her own heart and mind. She never created a friend, but seemed always to be sowing broadcast the dragon's teeth which sprung the harvest of armed enemies, against whom she rushed to battle. It was inexpressibly sad, then, what depth of sorrow to a mother who felt in her own heart the cause to observe in one so young this constant recognition of an averse world, and so fierce a training of the energies that were there to make good her cause in the contrast that must ensue. Gazing at Pearl, Hester Prynne often dropped her work upon her knees and cried out with agony which she would fain have hidden, but which made utterance for itself betwixt speech and a groan. O Father in heaven, if thou art still my Father, what is this being which I have brought into the world? And Pearl, overhearing the ejaculation, or aware through some more subtle channel of those throbs of anguish, would turn her vivid and beautiful little face upon her mother, smile with sprite-like intelligence, and resume her play. One peculiarity of the child's deportment remains yet to be told. The very first thing that she had noticed in her life was what? Not her mother's smile, responding to it as other babies do, by that faint embryo smile of the little mouth, remembered so doubtfully afterwards, and with such fond discussion whether it were indeed a smile. By no means. But that first object which Pearl seemed to become aware was, shall we say it? The scarlet letter on Hester's bosom. One day, as her mother stooped over the cradle, the infant's eyes had been caught by the glimmering of the gold embroidery on the letter, and putting up her little hand, she grasped it, smiling, not doubtfully, but with a decided gleam that gave her face the look of a much older child. Then, gasping for breath, did Hester Prynne clutch the fatal token instinctively, endeavoring to tear it away. So infinite was the torture inflicted by the intelligent touch of Pearl's baby hand. Again, as if her mother's agonized gesture were meant only to make sport for her, did Pearl look into her eyes and smile. From that epoch, except when the child was asleep, Hester had never felt a moment's safety, not a moment's calm enjoyment of her. Weeks, it is true, would sometimes elapse during which Pearl's gaze might never once be fixed upon the scarlet letter. But then again, it would become at unawares like the stroke of sudden death, and always with that peculiar smile and odd expression of the eyes. Once this freakish, elfish cast came into the child's eyes while Hester was looking at her own image in them, as mothers are fond of doing. And suddenly, for women in solitude and with troubled hearts are pestered with unaccountable delusions, she fancied that she beheld not her own miniature portrait, but another face in the small black mirror of Pearl's eye. It was a face, fiend-like, full of smiling malice, yet bearing the semblance of features that she had known full well, though seldom with a smile, and never with malice in them. It was as if an evil spirit possessed the child, and had just then peeped forth in mockery. Many a time afterwards had Hester been tortured, though less vividly, by the same illusion. In the afternoon of a certain summer's day, after Pearl grew big enough to run about, she amused herself with gathering handfuls of wildflowers and flinging them one by one at her mother's bosom, dancing up and down like a little elf whenever she hit the scarlet letter. Hester's first motion had been to cover her bosom clasped with her clasped hands. But whether from pride or resignation, or feeling that her penance might be best wrought out by this unmutterable pain, she resisted the impulse and sat erect, pale as death, looking sadly into little Pearl's wild eyes. Still came the battery of flowers, almost invariably hitting the mark and covering the mother's breast with hurts for which she could find no balm in this world, nor knew how to seek it in another. At last, her shot being all expended, the child stood still and gazed at Hester with a little laughing image of a fiend peeping out. Or whether it peeped or no, her mother had so imagined it, from the unsearchable abyss of her black eyes. "Child, what art thou?" cried the mother. "Oh, I'm your little Pearl," answered the child. But while she said it, Pearl laughed and began to dance up and down with the humorsome gesticulation of a little imp. whose next freak might be to fly up the chimney. Are you my child? In very truth, said Hester. Nor did she put the question altogether idly, but for the moment with a portion of genuine earnestness, for such is Pearl's wonderful intelligence that her mother half doubted whether she were not acquainted with the secret spell of her existence, and might not now reveal herself. Yes, I am little Pearl, repeated the child, continuing her antics. Thou art not my child, no Pearl of mine, said the mother half playfully, for it was often the case that a sportive impulse came over her in the midst of her deeper suffering. Tell me then, what art thou? What thou art? And who sent thee hither? Tell me, mother, said the child seriously, coming over to Hester and pressing herself close to her knees. Do tell me. Thy heavenly Father sent thee, answered Hester Prynne. But she said it with a hesitation that did not escape the acuteness of the child. Whether moved only by her ordinary freakishness or because of an evil spirit prompted her, she put up a small forefinger and touched the scarlet letter. He did not send me, cried she positively. I have no heavenly Father. Hush, Pearl, hush. Thou must not talk so, answered the mother, suppressing a groan. He sent us all into this world. He sent even me, thy mother, then much more thee. Or if not, thou strange and elfish child, whence didst thou come? Tell me, repeated Pearl, no longer seriously, but laughing and capering about the floor. It is thou that must tell me. But Hester could not resolve the query, being herself in a dismal labyrinth of doubt. She remembered, betwixt a smile and a shudder, the talk of the neighboring townspeople who, seeking vainly elsewhere for the child's paternity, and observing some of her odd attributes, had given out that poor little Pearl was a demon offspring, such as, ever since old Catholic times, had occasionally been on earth, through the agency of their mother's sin, and to promote some foul and wicked purpose. Luther, according to the scandal of his monkish enemies, was a brat of that hellish breed. Nor was Pearl the only child of whom this inauspicious origin was assigned among the New England Puritans. Chapter 7, Governor's Hall. Hester Prynne went one day into the mansion of Governor Bellingham with a pair of gloves. My dogs are about to go nuts. This might get weird. Hester Prynne went one day into the mansion of Governor Bellingham with a pair of gloves which he had friend and embroidered to his order, and which were to be worn on some great occasion of state, for, though the chances of popular election had caused this former ruler to descend a step or two from the highest rank, he still had held an honorable and influential place among the colonial magistracy. Another and far more important reason than the delivery of a pair of embroidered gloves impelled Hester at this time to seek an interview with the personage of so much power and activity in the affairs of the settlement. It had reached her ears that there was a design on the part of some of the leading inhabitants, cherishing the more rigid order of the principles in religion and government, to deprive her of her child. On the supposition that Pearl, as already hinted, was of demon origin, these good people, not unreasonably, argued that a Christian interest in the mother's soul required them to remove such a stumbling block from her path. If the child, on the other hand, were really capable of moral and religious growth and possessed the elements of ultimate salvation, then surely it would enjoy all the fairer prospect of these advantages by being transferred to wiser and better guardianship than Hester Prynne's. Among those who promoted the design, Governor Bellingham was said to be one of the most busy. It may appear singular, and indeed not a little ludicrous, that an affair of this kind, which in later days would have been referred to no higher jurisdiction than that of the select men of the town, should then have been a question publicly discussed, and on which statesmen of eminence took sides. At that epoch of pristine simplicity, however, matters of even slighter public interest, and of far less intrinsic weight than the welfare of Hester and her child, were strangely mixed up with the deliberations of legislators and acts of state. The period was hardly, if at all, earlier than that of our story, when a dispute concerning the right of property in a pig not only caused a fierce and bitter contest in the legislative body of the colony, but resulted in an important modification of the framework itself of the legislator. Full of concern, therefore, but so conscious of her own right that it seemed scarcely unequal match between the public on one side and a lonely woman, backed by the sympathies of nature on the other, Hester Prynne set forth from her solitary cottage. Little Pearl, of course, was her companion. She was now of an age to run lightly along by her mother's side, and constantly in motion from morn till sunset, could have accomplished a much longer journey than that before her. Often, nevertheless, more from caprice than necessity, she demanded to be taken up in arms, but was soon as imperious to be set down again and frisk onward before Hester on the grassy pathway with many a harmless trip and tumble. We have spoke of Pearl's rich and luxuriant beauty, a beauty that shone with deep and vivid tints, a bright complexion, eyes possessing intensity both of depth and glow, and hair already of a deep glossy brown, and which, in after years, would be nearly akin to black. There was a fire in her and throughout her, and she seemed the unpremeditated offshoot of a passionate moment. Her mother, in contriving the child's garb, had allowed the gorgeous tendencies of her imagination their full play, arraying her in a crimson velvet tunic of a peculiar cut, abundantly embroidered with fantasies and flourishes of gold thread. So much strength of coloring, which must be given a wan and pallid aspect to the cheeks of a fainter bloom, was admirably adapted to Pearl's beauty, and made her the very brightest little jet of flame that ever danced upon the earth. But it was a remarkable attribute of this garb, and indeed of the child's whole appearance, that it irresistibly and inevitably reminded the beholder of the token which Hester Prynne was doomed to wear upon her bosom. It was the scarlet letter in another form, the scarlet letter endowed with life. The mother herself, as if the red ignominy were so deep scorched into her brain that all her conceptions assumed its form, had carefully wrought out this similitude, lavishing many hours of morbid ingenuity to create an analogy between the object of her affection and the emblem of her guilt and torture. But in truth, Pearl was the one as well as the other. And only in the consequences of identity that had Hester contrived so perfectly to represent the scarlet letter in her appearance. As two wayfarers came within precincts of the town, the children of the Puritans looked up from their play, or what passed for play with those somber little urchins, and spake gravely to one another. Behold, verily, there is the woman of the scarlet letter. And of a truth, moreover, there is the likeness of the scarlet letter running along by her side. Come, therefore, and let us fling mud at them. But Pearl was a dauntless child, after frowning, stamping her foot, and shaking her little hand with a variety of threatening gestures, suddenly made a rush at the knot of her enemies, and put them all to flight. She resembled, in her fierce pursuit of them, an infant pestilence, the scarlet fever, or some such half-fledged angel judgment, whose mission was to punish the sins of a rising generation. She screamed and shouted, too, with a terrific volume of sound, which doubtless caused the hearts of the fugitives to quake within them. The victory accomplished, Pearl would returned quietly to her mother and looked up smiling at her face. Without further adventure, they reached the dwelling of Governor Bellingham. This was a large wooden house built in the fashion of which there were specimens still extant in the streets of the elder towns, now moss-grown, crumbling to decay and melancholy at heart, with the many sorrowful and joyful occurrences, remembered or forgotten, that have happened and passed within their dusky chambers. Then, however, was the freshness of the passing year on in the exterior, and the cheerfulness gleaming forth from the sunny windows of a human habitation, into which death had never entered. It had, indeed, a very cheery aspect, and the walls being overspread with a kind of stucco in which fragments of broken glass were plentifully intermixed, so that when the sunshine fell aslantwise over the front of the edifice, it glittered and sparkled as if diamonds had been flung against it by a double handful. The brilliancy might have befitted Aladdin's palace rather than the mansion of a grave old Puritan ruler. It was further decorated with strange and seemingly cabalistic figures and diagrams suitable for the quaint taste of the age, which had been drawn in the stucco when newly laid on, and had now grown hard and durable for the admiration of aftertimes. Pearl, looking at this bright wonder of a house, began to caper and dance, and imperatively required that the whole breath of sunshine should be stripped off its front and given to her to play with. "No, my little Pearl," said her mother, "thou must gather thine own sunshine. I have none to give thee." They approached the door, which was an arched form and flanked on each side by narrow tower or projection of the edifice, in both of which were lattice windows, with wooden shutters to close over them at need. Lifting the iron hammer that hung on the portal, Hester Prynne gave the summons, which was answered by one of the governor's bondservants, a free-born Englishman, but now 7 years' slave. During that term, he was to be the property of his master, and as much commodity of bargain and sale as an ox or a joint stool. The serf wore a blue coat, which was the customary garb of serving men at that period, and long before in the hereditary halls of England. "Is the worshipful Governor Bellingham within?" inquired Hester. "Yea, forsooth," replied the bondservant, staring with wide open eyes at the scarlet letter, which, now being a newcomer in the country, he had never before seen. "Yea, his honorable worship is within, but he hath a godly minister or two with him, and likewise a leech. You may not see his worship now." "Nevertheless, I will enter," answered Hester Prynne. And the bondservant, perhaps judging from the decision of her air and the glittering symbol on her bosom that she was a great lady in the land, offered no opposition. So the mother and the little Pearl were admitted into the hall of entrance, with many variations suggested by the nature of his building materials, diversity of climate, and a different mode of special life. Governor Bellingham had planned his new habitation after the residences of gentlemen of fair estate in his native land. Here, then, was a wide and reasonably lofty hall, extending through the whole depth of the house, and forming a medium of general communication, more or less directly, with all the other apartments. At one extremity, this spacious room was lighted by the windows of the two towers, which formed a small recess on either side of the portal. The other end, partly muffled by curtains, it was more powerfully illuminated by one of those embowed hall windows which we read of in old books, which was provided with a keep and cushion seat. Here on the cushion lay a folio tome, probably of the Chronicles of England or other substantial literature, even as in our own days we scattered gilded volumes on the center table, to be turned over by the casual guest. The furniture of the hall consisted of some ponderous chairs, the backs of which were elaborately carved with wreaths of oaken flowers, and likewise a table of the same taste, the whole being of the Elizabethan age, or perhaps earlier, and heirlooms transferred hither from the governor's paternal home. On the table, in token that this sentiment of old English hospitality had not been left behind, stood a large pewter tankard, at the bottom of which, had Hester or Pearl peeped into it, they might have seen the frothy remnant of a recent draught of ale. On the wall hung a row of portraits representing the forefathers of Bellingham lineage, some with armor on their breasts, and others with stately ruffs and robes of peace. All were characterized by the sternness and severity with which old portraits so invariably put on, as if they were the ghosts, rather than the pictures, of departed worthies, and were gazing with harsh and intolerant criticism at the pursuits and enjoyments of living men. At the center of the oaken panels that lined the hall was suspended a suit of mail not, like the pictures, an ancestral relic, but of the most modern date, for it had been manufactured by a skillful armorer in London, the same year in which Governor Bellingham came to New England. There was a steel headpiece, a cuirass, a gorget and greaves, a pair of gauntlets, and a sword hanging beneath, all and especially the helmet and breastplate, so highly burnished as to glow with white radiance, and scatter illumination everywhere about upon the floor. This bright panoply was not meant for mere idle show, but had been worn by the governor on many solemn muster and training field, and had glittered, moreover, at the head of the regiment in the Pequod War. For though bred a lawyer and accustomed to speak of Bacon, Coke, Noy, and Finch as his professional associates, the exigencies of this new country had transformed Governor Bellingham into a soldier, as well as a statesman and ruler. Little Pearl, who was greatly pleased with the gleaming armor as she had been with the glittering front piece of the house, spent some time looking into the polished mirror of the breastplate. "Mother," cried she, "I see you here. Look, look." Hester looked, by way of humoring the child, and saw that, owing to a particular effect of the convex mirror, the scarlet letter was represented in exaggerated and gigantic proportions, so as to be greatly the most prominent feature of her appearance. In truth, she seemed absolutely hidden behind it. Pearl pointed upward also at the similar picture in the headpiece, smiling at her mother, with that elfish intelligence that was so familiar in expression on her small physiognomy. That look of naughty merriment was likewise reflected in the mirror, with so much breadth and intensity of effect that it made Hester Prynne feel as if she could not be the image of her own child, but of an imp who could be seeking to mold itself into Pearl's shape. "Come along, Pearl," said she, drawing her away. "Come and look into this fair garden. It may be we shall see flowers there, more beautiful than the ones we find in the woods." Pearl accordingly ran to the bow window, and at the further end of the hall, and looked along the vista of the garden walk, carpeted with closely shaven grass and bordered with some rude and immature attempt at shrubbery. But the proprietor appeared already to have relinquished as hopeless the effects to perpetuate on this side of the Atlantic, in a hard soil and amid the close struggle for subsistence, the native English taste for ornamental gardening. Cabbages grew in plain sight, and a pumpkin vine, rooted at some distance, had run across the intervening space and deposited one of its gigantic products directly beneath the hall window, as if to warn the governor that this great lump of vegetable gold was as rich an ornament as New England earth would offer him. There were a few rose bushes, however, and a number of apple trees, probably the descendants of those planted by the Reverend Mr. Blackstone, the first settler of the peninsula, that half-mythological personage who rides through our early annals, seated at the back of a bull. Pearl, seeing the rose bushes, began to cry for a red rose, and would not be pacified. "Hush, child, hush," said her mother earnestly. "Do not cry, dear little Pearl. I hear voices in the garden. The governor is coming, and the gentleman along with him. In fact, down the vista of the garden avenue, a number of persons were seen approaching towards the house. Pearl, in utter scorn of her mother's attempt to quiet her, gave an eldritch scream, and then became silent, not from any notion of obedience, but because the quick and mobile curiosity of her disposition was exited by the appearances of those new personages. Chapter 8. The Elf Child and the Minister. Governor Bellingham, in a loose gown and easy cap, such an elderly gentleman loved to endue themselves with in their domestic privacy, walked foremost and appeared to be showing off his estate and expatiating upon the projected improvements. The wide circumference of an elaborate ruff beneath his gray beard, in the antiquated fashion of King James's reign, caused his head to look not a little like John the Baptist on a charger. The impression made by his aspect, so rigid and severe, and frostbitten with more than autumnal age, was hardly in keeping with the appliances of worldly enjoyment wherewith he had evidently done his utmost to surround himself. But it was an error to suppose that our grave forefathers, though accustomed to speak and think human existence was a state merely of trial and warfare, and though unfeignedly prepared to sacrifice goods and life at the behest of duty, made it a matter of conscience to reject such means of comfort or even luxury as lay fairly within their grasp. This creed was never taught, for instance, by the venerable Pastor John Wilson, whose beard, white as snowdrift, was seen over Governor Bellingham's shoulder, while its wearer suggested that pears and peaches might yet be naturalized within the New England climate, and that purple grapes might possibly be compelled to flourish against the sunny garden wall. The old clergyman, nurtured at the rich bosom of the English Church, had a long established and legitimate taste for all good, comfortable things. And however stern he might show himself in the pulpit or in his public reproof of such transgressions as that of Hester Prynne, still the genial benevolence of his private life had won him warmer affection than was accorded in any of his professional contemporaries. Behind the governor and Mr. Wilson came two other guests. One, the Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, whom the reader may remember as having taken a brief and reluctant part in the scene of Hester Prynne's disgrace, and in closer companionship with him, old Roger Chillingworth, a person of great skill in physic, who, for 2 or 3 years past, had been settled in town. It was understood that this learned man was a physician as well as a friend of the young minister, whose health had severely suffered of late by his too unreserved self-sacrifice to the labors and duties of the pastoral relation. The governor, in advance of his visitors, ascended 1 or 2 steps, and in throwing open the leaves of the giant hall window, found himself close to little Pearl. The shadow of the curtain fell over Hester Prynne and partially concealed her. "What have we here?" said Governor Bellingham, looking with surprise at the scarlet little figure before him. "I profess I have never seen the like since my days of vanity in old King James's time, when I was wont to esteem in a high favor to be admired to a court mask. There used to be a swarm of these little apparitions in holiday time, and we called them children of the Lord of Misrule. But who gat such a guest into my hall?" "I indeed," cried the good Mr. Wilson. What little bird of scarlet plumage may this be? Methinks I have seen such good figures when the sun has been shining through the richly painted window, and tracing out the golden and crimson images across the floor. But that was in the old land. Prithee, young one, who art thou? And what has ailed thy mother to bedizen thee in this strange fashion? Art thou a Christian child, huh? Dost know thy catechism? Or art thou one of those naughty elves or fairies whom we thought to have left behind us with other relics of papistry in merry old England? I am mother's child, answered the Scarlet Vision, and my name is Pearl. Pearl? Ruby, rather, or coral, or red rose, at the very least, judging by thy hue, responded the old minister, putting forth his hand in a vain attempt to pat little Pearl on the cheek. But where is this mother of thine? Ah, I see, he added, and turning to Governor Bellingham whispered, This is the selfsame child of whom we have held speech together, and behold here the unhappy woman, Hester Prynne, her mother. Sayest thou so? Cried the governor. Nay, we might have judged that such a child's mother must needs be a scarlet woman, and worthy of such type of her of Babylon. But she comes at a good time, and we will look at this matter forthwith. Governor Bellingham stepped through the window into the hall, followed by his three guests. Hester Prynne, said he, fixing his naturally stern regard on the wearer of the scarlet letter, there hath been much question concerning thee of late. The point hath been weightily discussed, whether we, that are the authority of influence, do well discharge our consciences by trusting an immortal soul, such as there is in yonder child, to the guidance of one who hath stumbled and fallen amid the pitfalls of this world. Speak thou, the child's own mother. Were it not, thinkest thou, for thy little one's temporal and eternal welfare, that she be taken out of thy charge and clad soberly and disciplined strictly and instructed in the truths of heaven and earth? What canst thou do for the child in this kind? I can teach my little Pearl what I have learned from this, answered Hester Prynne, laying a finger on the red token. Woman, it is thy badge of shame, replied the stern magistrate. It is because of the stain which that letter indicates that we would transfer the child to other hands. Nevertheless, said the mother calmly, though growing more pale, this badge hath taught me, it daily teaches me, it is teaching me at this moment, lessons whereof my child may be the wiser and better, albeit they can profit nothing to myself. We will judge warily, said Bellingham, and look well what we are about to do. Good Master Wilson, I pray you, examine this Pearl, since that is her name, and see whether she hath had such a Christian nurture that befits a child of her age. The old minister seated himself in an armchair and made an effort to draw Pearl betwixt his knees, but the child, unaccustomed to the touch or familiarity of any but her mother, escaped through the open window and stood on the upper step, looking like a wild tropical bird of rich plumage, ready to take night into the upper air. Mr. Wilson, not a little astonished at this outbreak, for he was a grandfatherly sort of personage and usually a vast favorite with children, essayed, however, to proceed with the examination. Pearl, said he with great solemnity, thou must take heed to instruction, that so, in due season, thou mayest wear in thy bosom the pearl of great price. Canst thou tell me, my child, who made thee? Now Pearl knew well enough who made her, for Hester Prynne, the daughter of a pious home, very soon after her talk with the child about her heavenly Father, had begun to inform her of those truths which a human spirit, at whatever stage of immaturity, imbibes with such eager interest. Pearl, therefore, so large were the attainments of her 3 years' lifetime, could have borne a fair examination of the New England primer, or the first column of the Westminster Catechism, although unacquainted with the outward form of either of those celebrated works. But that perversity, which all children have more or less of, and which little Pearl had tenfold portion, now at the most inopportune moment, took thorough possession of her, and closed her lips and impelled her to speak words amiss. After putting her finger in her mouth, with many ungracious refusals to answer good Mr. Wilson's question, the child finally announced that she had not been made at all, but had been plucked by her mother off a bush of wild roses that grew at the prison door. This fantasy was probably suggested by the near proximity of the governor's red roses, as Pearl stood outside of the window together with her recollection of the prison rosebush, which she had passed in coming hither. Old Roger Chillingworth, with a smile on his face, whispered something in the young clergyman's ear. Hester Prynne looked at the man of skill, and even then, with her fate hanging at the balance, was startled to perceive what a change had come over his features, how much uglier they were, how his dark complexion seemed to have grown duskier, and his figure more misshapen, since the days when she had familiarly known him. She met his eyes for an instant, but was immediately constrained to give all her attention to the scene now going forward. "This is awful!" cried the governor, slowly recovering from the astonishment into which Pearl's response had thrown him. "Here is a child of 3 years old, and she cannot tell who made her. Without question, she is equally in the dark as to her soul, its present depravity and future destiny. Methinks, gentlemen, we need inquire no further." Hester caught hold of Pearl, drew her forcibly into her arms, confronting the old Puritan magistrate with almost a fierce expression. Alone in the world, cast off by it, and with this sole treasure to keep her heart alive, she felt that she possessed indefeasible rights against the world, and was ready to defend them to the death. "God gave me this child," cried she. "He gave her in requital of all the things which ye had taken from me. She is my happiness, she is my torture, nonetheless. Pearl keeps me here in life. Pearl punishes me too. See ye not, she is the Scarlet Letter, only capable of being loved, and so endowed with a millionfold the power of retribution for my sin. Ye shall not take her, I will die first." "My poor woman," said the not unkind old minister, "the child shall be well cared for, far better than thou canst do it." "God gave her my keeping," repeated Hester Prynne, raising her voice almost to a shriek. "I will not give her up." And here, by sudden impulse, she turned to the young clergyman, Mr. Dimmesdale, at whom, up to this moment, she had seemed hardly so much as to once direct her eyes. "Speak thou for me," cried she. "Thou wast my pastor, and hast charge of my soul, and knowest me better than these men can. I will not lose this child. Speak for me." "Thou knowest, for thou hast sympathies which these men lack. Thou knowest what is in my heart, and what are a mother's rights, and how much the stronger they are when that mother has but her child and the Scarlet Letter. Look thou to it. I will not lose the child. Look to it." At this wild and singular appeal, which indicated that Hester Prynne's situation had provoked her to little less than madness, the young minister at once came forward, pale and holding his hand over his heart, as was his custom whenever his peculiarly nervous temperament was thrown into agitation. He looked now more careworn and emaciated than as we described him in the earlier scene of Hester's public ignominy. And whether it were his failing health, or whatever the cause might be, his large dark eyes had a world of pain in their troubled and melancholy depth. "There is truth in what she says," began the minister, with a voice sweet, tremulous, and powerful, insomuch that the hall re-echoed and the hollow armor rang with it. Truth in what Hester says, and in the feeling which inspires her. God gave her that child, and gave her too an instinctive knowledge of its nature and requirements, both seemingly so peculiar, which no other mortal being can possess. And moreover, is there not a quality of awful sacredness to the relation between this mother and this child? Aye, how is that, good Master Dimmesdale? Interrupted the governor. Make that plain, I pray you. It must be even so, resumed the minister, for if we deem it otherwise, do we not thereby say the heavenly Father, the creator of all flesh, hath lightly recognized a deed of sin, and made no account the distinction between unhallowed lust and holy love? This child of its father's guilt and its mother's shame has come from the hand of God to work in many ways upon her heart, who pleads so earnestly and with such bitterness of spirit the right to keep her. It was meant for a blessing, for the one blessing of her life. It was meant, doubtless, as the mother herself had told us, for a retribution too, a torture to be felt at many an unthought of moment, a pang, a sting, an ever-recurring agony in the midst of troubled joy. Has she not expressed this thought in the garb of the poor child, so forcibly reminding us of the red symbol which sears her bosom? Well said again, cried good Mr. Wilson. I feared the woman had no better thought than to make a mountebank of her child. Oh no, not so, not so, continued Mr. Dimmesdale. She recognizes, believe me, the solemn miracle which God hath wrought in the existence of this child. And may she feel too what methinks is very truth, that this boon was meant above all else to keep the mother's soul alive, and to preserve her from the blacker depths of sin into which Satan might have else sought to plunge her. Therefore it is good for the poor simple woman that she hath an infant immortality, a being capable of eternal joy and sorrow, confided into her care, to be trained up by her to righteousness, to remind her at every moment of her fall, yet to teach her, as it were by the Creator's sacred pledge, that if she bring the child to heaven, the child will also bring its parent thither. Herein is the sinful mother happier than the sinful father. For Hester Prynne's sake, then, and no less for the poor child's sake, let us leave them as Providence has seen fit to place them. You speak, my friend, with a strange earnestness, said old Roger Chillingworth, smiling at him. And there is a weighty import in what my young brother hath spoken, said the Reverend Mr. Wilson. What say you, worshipful Master Bellingham? Hath he not pleaded well for the poor woman? Indeed hath he, answered the magistrate, and hath adduced such arguments that we will even leave the matter as it now stands, so long, at least, as there shall be no further scandal in the woman. Care must be had, nevertheless, to put the child to due and stated examination in the catechism at thy hands, or Master Dimmesdale's. Moreover, at the proper season, the tithing men must take heed that she go both to school and to meeting. The young minister, on ceasing to speak, had withdrawn a few steps from the group, and stood with his face partially concealed in the heavy folds of the window curtain, while the shadow of his figure, which the sunlight cast upon the floor, was tremulous with the vehemence of his appeal. Pearl, that wild and flighty little elf, stole softly towards him, and taking his hand in the grasp of both her own, laid her cheek against it. A caress so tender, and withal so unobtrusive, that her mother, who was looking on, asked herself, "Is that my Pearl?" Yet she knew that there was a love in the child's heart, although it mostly revealed itself in passion, and hardly twice in her lifetime had been softened to such gentleness as now. The minister, for save the long-sought regards of woman, nothing is sweeter than these marks of childish preference, accorded spontaneously with the spiritual instinct, and therefore seeming to imply in us something truly worthy to be loved. The minister looked round, laid his hand on the child's head, hesitated a moment, and then kissed her brow. Little Pearl's unwonted mood of sentiment lasted no longer. She laughed and went capering down the hall so airily that old Mr. Wilson raised a question of whether her tiptoes even touched the floor. "The little baggage hath witchcraft in her, I profess," said he to Mr. Dimmesdale. "She needs no old woman's broomstick to fly withal." "Strange child," remarked Roger Chillingworth. "It is easy to see the mother's part in her. Would it be beyond a philosopher's research, think you, gentlemen, to analyze that child's nature and, from its make and mold, give a shrewd guess at the father? Nay, it would be sinful in such a question to follow the clue of profane philosophy," said Mr. Wilson. "Better to fast and pray upon it. And still better, it may be, to leave the mystery as we find it, unless Providence reveal it of its own accord. Thereby every good Christian man hath a title to show a father's kindness towards the poor deserted babe." The affair being so satisfactorily concluded, Hester Prynne with Pearl departed from the house. As they descended the steps, it averred that the lattice of the chamber window was thrown open, and forth into the sunny day was thrust the face of Mistress Hibbins, Governor Bellingham's bitter-tempered sister, and the same who, a few years later, was executed as a witch. "Hist, hist," said she, while her ill-omened physiognomy seemed to cast a shadow over the cheerful newness of the house. "Wilt thou go with us tonight? There will be a merry company in the forest, and I well nigh promise the black man that comely Hester Prynne should make one." "Make my excuse to him, so please you," answered Hester with a triumphant smile. "I must tarry at home and keep watch over my little Pearl. Had they taken her from me, I would willingly have gone with thee to the forest and signed my name into the black man's book too, and that with mine own blood." "We shall have thee there anon," said the witch lady, frowning as she drew back her hand. But here, if we suppose this interview betwixt Mistress Hibbins and Hester Prynne to be authentic and not a parable, was already an illustration of the young minister's argument against sundering the relation of a fallen mother to the offspring of her frailty. Even thus early had the child saved her from Satan's snare. We'll pick up with the leech tomorrow.